For 17 years, the Houthis controlled one of the most strategically valuable choke points on planet Earth. The Bab el-Mandeb Strait, 20 miles wide at its narrowest point, the gateway through which roughly 12% of all global maritime trade has historically passed. Iran spent 2 decades and billions of dollars building this leverage. Anti-ship ballistic missiles smuggled in pieces through Oman. Drone manufacturing facilities buried in the mountains outside Sada. A network of coastal radar stations stretching from Hodeidah to the Saudi border. The entire architecture was designed for one purpose, to ensure that whenever Tehran needed to apply pressure on the global economy, the Red Sea would close on command. That architecture just collapsed. Not gradually, not partially, catastrophically, and in a single 72-hour window that has fundamentally restructured the balance of power in the entire Middle East. Read those words carefully, because what occurred in the Red Sea over the past 3 days has no precedent in modern naval warfare. Iran launched what was supposed to be the demonstration strike that would prove its regional reach remained intact. A coordinated salvo of Houthi-fired anti-ship missiles, kamikaze drones, and what intelligence sources are now identifying as a previously undisclosed class of underwater unmanned vehicle. The operation was meant to send an unmistakable message that any Western military movement through the Strait would be contested, deterred, and if necessary, destroyed. The message that was sent was the opposite of the one Tehran intended. What entered the Red Sea on the morning of the strike was not what Iranian intelligence had assessed it would be. The Iranian targeting calculus had been built around an outdated picture of American naval deployment, an assumption that the carrier strike group operating in the region remained the Eisenhower with its known electronic warfare signature and predictable air-wing composition. That assumption was catastrophically wrong. What had quietly transited Suez under conditions of complete operational silence was something else entirely. And what it carried changes everything that comes next. Stay with this analysis carefully, because what unfolds from here requires understanding not just what happened in the Strait, but why every previous framework for assessing the Iranian Houthi threat just became operationally obsolete. The reversal is so complete that the men who designed the original strategy in Tehran are now confronting a problem they have no playbook for solving. To understand the magnitude of what just occurred, the foundation must be properly laid. The Houthi missile and drone capability did not develop organically from indigenous Yemeni industrial capacity. It was constructed deliberately, methodically, and at enormous cost by the Quds Force apparatus operating through smuggling networks that ran from Bandar Abbas through Omani waters and into Hodeidah port over the better part of 15 years. The arsenal that emerged by 2025 represented the single most sophisticated non-state military capability ever assembled anywhere on Earth. The numbers themselves were staggering. By the most recent Western intelligence assessments, the Houthis fielded approximately 3,000 ballistic and cruise missiles of varying ranges, between 8,000 and 12,000 attack drones in operational stockpiles, and a coastal defense network anchored by the Iranian-supplied Noor anti-ship missile, a reverse-engineered derivative of the Chinese C-802 with terminal guidance modifications that gave it credible engagement capability against modern naval vessels. The Aerospace Command of the IRGC, under Amir Ali Hajizadeh, had specifically tailored the Houthi inventory to defeat the standard American carrier strike group defensive architecture. The strategic logic that produced this arsenal was elegant in its design. Iran could not directly confront American naval power in any conventional sense. The arithmetic of that confrontation produced no scenario in which Tehran prevailed. But Iran did not need to prevail in direct confrontation. It needed only to make the Red Sea uneconomical for global commerce, which would force Western powers into a position of either accepting massive economic disruption or paying a political price for any military operation against the Houthi infrastructure. The leverage was constructed not against the United States Navy, but against the global insurance markets, the shipping conglomerates, the energy importers in Europe and Asia, whose calculations would determine whether Western governments could sustain any campaign against the Houthi apparatus. For 17 years, that calculation held. The 2015 Saudi-led intervention failed to dismantle Houthi capabilities. The 2024 Operation Prosperity Guardian degraded, but did not eliminate the missile and drone threat. Even the more aggressive American strikes throughout late 2024 and into 2025 produced only temporary suppression of Houthi launches, with the apparatus rebuilding within weeks of every campaign that targeted it. But here is what Tehran fundamentally failed to understand about the trap that just closed around its proxy network. The Western response was never going to come through the front door. The mechanism that produced the catastrophic Iranian failure began assembling itself approximately 18 months ago through a series of decisions that appeared unrelated when they occurred individually. In late 2024, the Pentagon initiated a quiet program designated under a classification level that remains undisclosed in any public documentation. The program's objective was not the destruction of Houthi launch infrastructure, which had proven repeatedly impossible to achieve through conventional strikes. The objective was the development of an integrated counter-anti-access capability specifically designed for the Bab el-Mandeb choke point geometry. What that program produced is now operating in the Red Sea. The platform that transited Suez under operational silence is a configuration of capabilities that has never been deployed publicly before. The Carrier Strike Group designation conceals the actual nature of the formation, which combines elements of three previously separate command structures into a single integrated apparatus. The Air Wing carries a complement of F-35C variants whose electronic warfare configurations have been upgraded with capabilities derived from technology transfers that resulted from the 2024 reorganization of Allied defense industrial cooperation. The accompanying destroyers carry the Aegis Baseline 10 upgrade with the cooperative engagement capability that allows distributed sensor networking across the entire battle group. And the submarine component, which was not publicly disclosed in any pre-deployment briefing, includes capabilities specifically designed to address the underwater threat environment that the Houthis had been quietly developing. Now look at what this means across every theater where Iranian-backed forces project influence simultaneously, because the implications extend far beyond Yemen and the Red Sea. When the Houthi salvo launched on the morning of the strike, the targeting solution that the Iranian apparatus had developed encountered a defensive architecture it had not been calibrated to defeat. The anti-ship ballistic missiles, which had previously demonstrated capability against commercial shipping and even degraded engagement results against American destroyers, were intercepted at ranges that the Iranian engineers who designed the targeting profiles had assessed as outside the defensive envelope. The drone swarm, which had been timed to saturate point defense systems during the missile terminal phase, was engaged by directed energy weapons whose deployment status had been deliberately obscured in all previous American naval activity in the region. But the most devastating element of the engagement was not the defensive performance. It was what came next. Within 40 minutes of the Houthi launch, American and Allied platforms executed a coordinated counterstrike that demonstrated capabilities the Iranian apparatus had not assessed as currently operational. Long-range precision munitions launched from positions outside the Houthi sensor envelope struck specific coordinates that corresponded to the Iranian-built command and control nodes that coordinated the original launch. Cyber operations executed simultaneously degraded the communications architecture that connected the Houthi field commanders to the IRGC liaison officers embedded in their command structure. And electronic warfare effects propagated through the entire Iranian regional sensor network, producing what intelligence sources are describing as a comprehensive degradation of Iranian situational awareness across multiple theaters at once. The arithmetic that resulted from these 40 minutes is devastating in its implications. The Houthi capability that had been built over 15 years did not just fail to achieve its mission objective. It exposed the entire architecture of Iranian regional projection to a counter-capability that Tehran had not known existed. Every assumption that had structured Iranian strategic calculations since 2015 just became obsolete. Hossein Salami, commander of the IRGC, received the initial damage assessment at his command center outside Tehran approximately 3 hours after the engagement concluded. The assessment that landed on his desk was not the routine post-strike analysis that his apparatus had grown accustomed to processing. It was a complete inventory of capabilities that the Americans had just demonstrated, capabilities whose existence had been actively denied or obscured in every previous intelligence collection cycle his organization had conducted. The men in that room understood immediately what they were looking at. The strategic premise on which Iranian regional power had rested for 2 decades had just been invalidated in a single afternoon. But this is where the situation becomes genuinely uncontrollable, because the Iranian response options have been catastrophically narrowed by the very capability demonstration they just witnessed. Ismail Kiani, who commands the Quds Force and oversees the proxy network architecture, faces a calculation that has no good answer. Escalation through other proxy theaters, including Hezbollah-aligned forces in Lebanon and Iraqi Shia militia networks, now carries risk that those forces will encounter the same counter-capability that just devastated the Houthi operation. The deterrent value of the entire proxy network depends on the assumption that Western response will remain within previously demonstrated capability envelopes. That assumption no longer holds. Hajizadeh, whose aerospace command designed the Houthi inventory and trained the operators, must now confront the possibility that every weapon system his organization has fielded across the entire Iranian arsenal carries vulnerabilities the Americans have already characterized but not previously demonstrated. The implication is structural. If the United States held back capability against the Houthis until the strategic moment justified its disclosure, what other capabilities are being held in reserve for the moment when direct action against Iranian territory becomes politically necessary? President Masoud Pezeshkian has discovered that his domestic political position has been compromised in ways that no Iranian president has experienced since the early 1980s. His reformist coalition had been operating on the assumption that Iranian regional capability provided sufficient leverage to negotiate sanctions relief from a position of relative strength. That leverage has just collapsed. The constituencies inside the Iranian government that had been arguing for accommodation with Western powers now confront the reality that accommodation may be the only option available, while the hardline factions that had been arguing for confrontation now face the impossibility of confrontation under current conditions. In Tel Aviv, the assessment is being conducted with intensity that has not characterized Israeli strategic analysis since the early phases of the Iran nuclear program crisis. Benjamin's government convened the Security Cabinet for a session that lasted 9 hours, with participation from intelligence directorate heads, Air Force Command, and the Mossad operational leadership. The discussion focused on a question that had been theoretical until this week and is now operationally urgent. If American capability has advanced to the level demonstrated against the Houthis, does the calculation around direct action against Iranian nuclear infrastructure change fundamentally? The Israeli intelligence community has begun running scenarios that had been considered too aggressive to develop seriously in previous threat assessment cycles. What does a coordinated strike against Iranian nuclear infrastructure look like when the Iranian air defense network has just been demonstrated to be vulnerable to capabilities Tehran did not know existed? What does the post-strike escalation environment look like when Iranian retaliation options through proxies have been exposed as catastrophically less capable than previous assessments indicated? What does the diplomatic environment look like when the strategic premise that had constrained Western action against Iranian territory has just been invalidated? In Riyadh, Mohammed bin Salman convened his Security Council for an extended session focused on the implications for the regional security architecture. The Saudi assessment, according to fragmentary reporting reaching Western capitals, identified both opportunities and dangers in the new strategic environment. The opportunity is obvious. The Houthi threat that has constrained Saudi southern security for 15 years has been operationally degraded in ways that may prove difficult to reverse. The danger is less immediately visible, but potentially more consequential. A Tehran apparatus that has just experienced this magnitude of strategic shock may pursue actions that no rational calculation would have predicted, simply because the arithmetic that previously constrained Iranian behavior no longer applies. In Beijing, the analysis is proceeding through channels that the Chinese strategic community rarely activates publicly. The People's Liberation Army Navy, which has been observing American naval capability development with increasing intensity, just received a public demonstration of capabilities that will require fundamental reassessment of Chinese maritime strategy in the Western Pacific. If the same capabilities that defeated the Houthi anti-Axis architecture can be deployed against the much more sophisticated Chinese capability in the South China Sea and around Taiwan, the entire premise of Chinese regional strategy may require restructuring. The Chinese response to the Red Sea events has been carefully measured in public statements while the internal analytical apparatus operates at maximum tempo. But the most disturbing element of the entire crisis is not what is visible. It is what the demonstration in the Red Sea revealed about the timing of American strategic decisions. Donald approved the deployment configuration that produced this outcome approximately 14 months ago, according to sources familiar with the decision-making process. The deployment was timed deliberately to coincide with the Iranian assessment cycle that would have been processing the implications of the Hezbollah degradation in Lebanon, the Syrian regime transition, and the broader collapse of the Iranian regional position throughout 2024 and 2025. The American calculation was that Tehran would attempt a demonstration of remaining capability through the Houthi proxy, specifically because the regional position had become so degraded that demonstrative action was politically necessary for the Iranian leadership. That calculation was correct. The trap was set 18 months ago. The trigger was the predictable Iranian decision to attempt the demonstration that produced the engagement that exposed the entire architecture of Iranian regional capability to a counter-capability the Americans had been developing specifically for this moment. The implication is not that the Americans got lucky. The implication is that the entire sequence was designed, from the timing of the deployment through the configuration of the capability set through the operational silence that concealed the actual nature of the platform until the engagement began. Tehran walked into an apparatus that had been constructed to receive exactly the kind of operation Iran chose to execute. The strategic surprise was not tactical. It was systemic. The Iranian decision-making process was being modeled by American analysts with sufficient accuracy that the response capability could be optimized for the specific scenario that Iran would predictably choose. This level of strategic predictive accuracy carries implications that extend far beyond the Red Sea engagement. If the American intelligence apparatus can model Iranian decision-making at this level of precision regarding proxy operations, the same modeling capability presumably applies to other categories of Iranian strategic decisions. The implication is that Tehran has been operating in a strategic environment where its decisions are being anticipated and pre-positioned against, in ways that the Iranian leadership has not been aware of. The window for Iranian recovery from this strategic shock is narrowing by the hour. The hardline faction within the IRGC, recognizing the magnitude of what has occurred, is reportedly arguing for immediate escalation through other theaters specifically to demonstrate that Iranian capability remains operational somewhere in the regional architecture. The pragmatist faction, which had been gaining influence through 2025 as the regional position deteriorated, is arguing that escalation under current conditions risks demonstrating exactly the opposite of what the hardliners intend, namely that every theater of Iranian capability is vulnerable to the same counter-capability that just devastated the Houthi operation. The clerical establishment in Qom is responding through channels that have not been activated at this intensity since the early phases of the Iran-Iraq War. Senior ayatollahs have begun issuing statements whose religious language conceals operational coordination about whether the regime can sustain its current strategic posture or whether fundamental restructuring of Iranian foreign policy has become unavoidable. Pezeshkian's government is attempting to leverage the crisis to advance reformist policy positions that had been blocked through 2024 and 2025 by the hardline coalition. His allies in the parliament have begun introducing measures that would adjust Iranian strategic posture in ways that recognize the new reality of Western counter-capability. Whether the IRGC will accept this restructuring, or whether the hardline faction will move against the reformist coalition before it can consolidate its position, remains the central unresolved question in Tehran. The countdown that matters most is not the one running on Iranian decision-making in isolation. It is the convergence of multiple countdowns running simultaneously across different decision centers. Tehran has perhaps 2 weeks before the strategic shock either consolidates into a coherent response or fragments the Iranian leadership in ways that make coherent response impossible. Tel Aviv has perhaps a similar window to determine whether the demonstrated American capability creates the conditions for direct action against Iranian nuclear infrastructure or whether the diplomatic environment shifts in ways that close that window. Washington has perhaps a longer window but faces its own decision pressure regarding whether to consolidate the strategic gain through diplomatic engagement or to press the advantage through additional capability demonstrations. The men who matter in this calculation are operating with limited information about each other's actual decision processes. The Iranian leadership does not know what additional capabilities the Americans are holding in reserve. The American leadership does not know whether the Iranian shock will produce capitulation or desperate escalation. The Israeli leadership does not know whether the window for direct action will close before it opens. The Saudi leadership does not know whether to press the advantage against the Houthi infrastructure or to consolidate the regional position diplomatically. Every decision maker is calculating against an environment in which the previous framework has collapsed and the new framework has not yet been established. What enters the Red Sea over the coming days will determine the security architecture of the entire region for the next decade. Additional American naval deployments are reportedly being prepared for transit through Suez, with capability sets that have not been disclosed publicly. The Israeli Air Force is conducting exercises whose pattern suggests preparation for operations against targets that have not been engaged in any previous campaign. The Iranian apparatus is moving forces in patterns that intelligence analysts are reporting do not correspond to any previously characterized contingency. The arithmetic of the next 90 days will determine whether the strategic restructuring that began in the Red Sea consolidates into a sustained shift in regional power, or whether it triggers a counter-response that produces consequences nobody is currently positioned to predict. The clock is running on decisions whose consequences will track through every subsequent development in the Middle East for years to come. The architecture has shifted. The mechanism has been demonstrated. The leverage has been transferred. And the men who must respond are operating from positions whose vulnerabilities have just been catastrophically exposed. The world is watching the Red Sea. The clock has never been closer to a moment of fundamental restructuring. And the next chapter of this story has not yet been written, but the architecture that will produce it has already been built.